Now, here we go. All right. Good enough. For Collins, the humidity was the worst part. He'd dealt with hot before. You'd be surprised just how sweltering it could get at sea. But at sea, there's a breeze and salty spray. Sure, this truly wretched swampland was crawling with shade, but that didn't matter when the air was practically dripping with body temperature water. Keeping his brews cool was another challenge. Some of the more practical tonics flat out wouldn't work if they climbed above a particular temperature. Others, brewed only for taste, would simply turn. Weeks or months of careful work and attention gone as surely as if they'd been poured into the sea. On the other hand, Collins had read about some interesting Zonvian warm fermentation methods and recipes that he'd already been able to get going. No Villasavian tincture had produced effects like lasting low light vision or real invisibility, but these recipes looked promising. It was good he'd had the opportunity to find the ingredients before he'd been shipped away from Vilasov's beautiful portside markets. The sun had set, but that only meant the mosquitoes were out. It was still quite muggy, and if the last week had been any indication, it would stay that way for some hours yet. Too few nighttime hours feel truly nocturnal, he mused, sipping on a lightly fruity ale he'd worked up before he'd made the journey southward. It was one of the last of its batch, but it had stayed nice and cold, a strong contrast to the humid night. The door to the little dorm shack he'd been assigned squeaked open, and Freya joined him on the porch, sitting in the other mangrove wood chair and gazing out into the murky evening. She had brought another of the still-cold beers with her, which she seemed to be enjoying. After several moments of companionable silence, but for the night bugs, Freya abruptly smacked her arm and shook her head, wiping her hand on the thigh of her pants. "At least we are not so deep that the really big bugs can find us." "Or worse," said Collins. "Oh? What have you heard?" "Apparently folks have been having trouble getting to and from plots 11 and 12. Seems there's a monster in the water out that way." He took a pensive swig. Freya cocked an eyebrow in amusement. "A monster, huh? You Villasavians are a bunch of doughy city folk." Collins laughed. "I agree. It's no monster, just some big mean animal that hopefully hasn't developed a taste for human flesh yet." "Oh, and doughy? Cute." Freya laughed too. "It's not my fault you all are known for bread and cheese. In fairness, though, this beer is delicious. I have never had anything like it. It was made by you?" "It was. Not many raspberries out in Zambia, are there?" "No, but I can smell the chomba fruit you are fermenting as plain as the nose on your face when I go out back, which, incidentally, will be just as prominent once your brew is finished as it is now." Delivered that a little bit wrong, so I inflected it different than I want it to be. It is story time. Welcome back, Evan. So that sentence should have been, "which, incidentally, will be just as prominent once your brew is finished as it is now." She shook her head as she took another drink from her bottle. "Did nobody tell you are chasing fairy tales?" "Who said anything about fairy tales?" "That nincompoop Zedium Kuranabe was selling what we would call rooster eggs in your language. Surely you have heard of someone trying his invisible potion recipe." Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was gentle, almost motherly, which annoyed Collins because she was hardly older than him. Of course the recipe doesn't work as it's written. Old Zeddy didn't have access to ingredients from our side of the sea, so I've tweaked it with some promising catalysts I found a lot of success with. And besides, I think it smells delicious. I'm really interested to see how it turns out. Rhea wrinkled her nose. "Oof, I have never liked chomba. It makes my tongue itch." She took a swig of beer as if to wash the offending flavor away. "Think of what it could mean for my career if I do discover something, though. I could get a promotion out of here. Maybe even to the maktaba of my choice." "Here is not so bad, but I do see your point. Without experimentation, progress is not made, and new things are not learned. I applaud your motives. I only worry you will be misled like many before you. And what of your other skill? Another miraculous recipe by Koronabe?" "No, I believe this one is more proven." "You don't know it by smell?" Freya smiled. "Apples have many uses on both sides of our sea." "So they do," Collins said, smiling himself. "You have a tree whose root can enhance sight in the dark, I believe. The apples are simply for flavor." "Ah, the baobab branch, a classic. Apples are a good choice. It has a tendency to be quite sour." "Branch? I read that it was the root that had the active ingredient. Araya laughed. Yes, yes, the root. We have a legend that the baobabs were turned upside down just after creation, for their limbs grow high and thick, spreading with the appearance of roots when they lose their leaves in the dry season. So, in our language, the herb you speak of is referred to as branch, because the roots are up above. Charmingly paradoxical, was all Collins said as he tilted his head back, finishing his drink. The next day, Collins found himself in just the right place at the right time. He was in the small workspace he'd been granted, checking on several samples he'd dried for various medicinal recipes and experiments, when he heard commotion at the dock. Glancing out his little window, he saw one of the farmers standing up in his flat-bottomed boat, bare-chested and covered in blood. At his feet was what looked like a pile of bloody rags, and he was screaming for help. Before he knew what he was doing, Collins was already rushing across the mushy, cleared ground to the dock. A pair of burly craftswomen were gingerly lifting the injured man when Collins reached the scene. Just came out of nowhere. I don't know how I managed to get him back in the boat, let alone get us both back here, the shirtless farmer was saying. When neither woman responded, Collins said, Adrenaline is an incredible thing. Were you hurt? Not by the monster. Can you help him? The injured man had been laid on the gnarled wood of the dock by now. One of the women had jogged off toward the main building of the maktaba. The other was kneeling beside the unconscious man. Collins knelt on his other side and asked her, How bad is it? His left arm is missing at the elbow, and it looks like most of his right foot is missing as well. He also seems to have bite marks across his chest and back, so I wouldn't be surprised if some ribs are broken as well. But he's breathing too well for there to be any damage to a lung. It's the swamp water in the wounds I'm worried about right now. Got it, Collins said, springing up and running back to his workroom. He grabbed a handful of freshly dried willow bark and his bag of poultices and raced to where the unconscious man still lay. He thrust his bag into the woman's hands and said, Find a clear bottle with thick greenish goo in it, blue cork stopper, little black chunks in the goo. Hurriedly, delicately, he began to unwrap the makeshift bandages the other farmer had applied, impressed by the man's presence under pressure. He heard the sound of a cork leaving a bottle's mouth. This? Collins nodded. Collins nodded, taking the poultice and beginning to apply it to the smaller wounds on the chest, then the man's foot and leg. He didn't dare unwrap the man's arm until real bandages and someone with actual medical training arrived. He did put some on the outside of the bloody stump's wraps, but Collins knew it wouldn't do much. Looking at the willow bark, he realized this man was beyond the help of a simple pain reliever, so he stowed it away in his bag. By this time, the other craftswoman was returning with the only true medic currently stationed in the swamp. The medic wore a backpack and carried a small pitcher. The craftswoman carried a large jug of drinking water. I'll take it from here, the medic said. What is it you've rubbed all over my patient? Antiseptic and anti-inflammatory, sir. Did you wash the wounds first? The pale man knelt with a flourish of his red and white patterned cloak, delicately unwrapping the more grisly wounds as the craftswoman readied the water jug. Well, no, sir. We had only swamp water to hand, and that felt counterproductive. This concoction you've cooked up is certainly pungent. Its value, though, remains to be seen. You may go, Collins. I've no need of your further help. Oh, okay. Collins quickly gathered his things and went back to his experiments. It wasn't long before there was a knock on the door frame. It was too humid to keep the door shut. Turning from the window, where he'd been watching the medic continue to tend to the injured man, he saw the craftswoman who'd helped him. She held out the vial he'd had her extract from his bag. You forgot this. Oh, thanks. How's he doing? Collins moved to take the little bottle. Doc says he'll live. I don't think you deserve to be sent away like that, for what it's worth. Thanks. The higher-ups don't always appreciate it when those of us looking to move up stick out our necks. Acting outside our mandate, you know? She shrugged. To my eye, you're the one who saved that guy's life. Everyone knows you couldn't nurse him back to health, but it was your reaction, your quick thinking that strung him along till the medic could get there. Speaking of, that stuff you had me open smells terrible. It'll help with infection? Collins chuckled despite his gloom. It will. Peppermint and black garlic aren't a great combination when you're cooking, it's true, but I haven't found a better mix for cleaning wounds. You're pretty comfortable around blood and broken bones for a carpenter, aren't you? You'd be surprised. When you're at sea, the difference between a doctor and a carpenter gets smaller as the injuries get more serious. Collins was quiet as he looked back out the window. The medic was finishing with the fresh bandages, and the other craftswoman had apparently been sent for a stretcher, which she was already back with. Seeing this, the woman he'd been talking to bade him farewell and went to help carry the injured man to the infirmary. That evening found Collins back on his dorm shack's porch, sipping a new brew. He'd spent his free time as the sun was setting decanting a small batch of an ale that had fermented as he traveled from Vilsav. It was a proven recipe, one which traveled well, but a bitter one, patterned after the brews Vilsavian brewers would export to places all across the sea. It had traveled well enough, but the style was not one of his favorites. Rhea, however, seemed to be enjoying hers. When asked, she said, "It reminds me of my home. When I was a teenager, my father started to drink something much like this instead of Zonvian wines. The smell brings me right back to him." She'd heard about the afternoon's excitement and had agreed with the craftswoman that Collins had saved that man's life. It did little to improve Collins' mood, though, and he stewed over the medic's casual dismissal into the night. Collins had hardly set up his day's work when a runner knocked on his workroom doorframe. "The Mabwana have sent for you, sir," the young man breathlessly announced. "You're their first order of business for today." "Oh," was all Collins could manage as his mind began to race. He had acted above his station. He had no medical training. Everything he knew had come from supplemental reading. His training was mostly culinary in nature, if he was being honest. Potions were a natural extension of brewing, and he seemed to be a quick study with it, but yesterday's poor farmer was far beyond anything his potions or poultices could have done. Then again, if the man still lived, he definitely played a part in keeping him alive. Perhaps he'd be lucky, and rather than getting a real punishment, the Mabwana would simply require him to take some medical courses so as to prevent him from obstructing medical personnel in the future. Regardless, he steeled himself for the inevitable lecture he'd receive as he stood before the council which ran this maktaba. The runner led him to a pair of closed double doors in the maktaba's main building and gestured for Collins to knock. He obliged, and the young man nodded once briskly and disappeared around a corner. "Enter, please," came a voice from inside, so Collins turned the knob and went in. A large, round table with a stone top dominated the center of the room, and bookshelves lined 3 of the walls. The 4th consisted mostly of windows, which offered a full view of the parade field at the center of the main complex. Collins could clearly see the dock where the injured man had arrived the previous day. If the Mabwana had a clear view of the incident, his chances seemed even worse. Around the table sat the Mabwana, a council of 6 whose complexions were evenly split for equal representation of both sides of the sea. Everything the Mabwana did was voted on, tie broken by a second vote by those from across the sea. The same system was used for Maktaba in Zanvia. How would they decide Collins's fate today? Charles, a Vilsavian man at least twice Collins' age, gestured to an empty 7th chair at the table, its back to the windows. "Won't you sit down, Collins?" "Sit? I'm not in trouble?" A portly, sweaty Zanvian man named Beamaka burst out laughing. "Trouble? No, sir! We happened to catch yesterday's bout of excitement from our box seats here, and if nothing else, you are to be commended. Your quick thinking saved that poor man. I dare say without your little concoction, the poor fellow would not have made it to the operating table." Collins sat, working to process Beamaka's words. "So," said Clarissa, an ancient-looking Zanvian woman, "we now want to ask you how you would take care of the monster out there. 'Tis obviously not merely a story, for stories do not bite a man's arm off." "You want my opinion? But it's your work that has gotten me this far in my career, madam, such as it is." "Your humility is admirable, young Collins. But it is your iteration upon my work which has gotten you here. Any fool can follow a recipe. It takes someone special to cook." Beamaka chuckled. "You've been on this side of the sea too long, dear Clarissa. You're sounding rather Vilsavian today." She snorted. "You say I'm the one who sounds Vilsavian. In a Vilsavian accent. Do you even remember how to speak our mother tongue, young one?" "Unanita shaka," Beamaka said sadly. "I do doubt you," Clarissa said, good humor still in her voice. "But in any event, we must discuss the task at hand. What do we know of this creature, Liana?" A Vilsavian woman who looked to be 10 years younger than Beamaka adjusted her spectacles and shuffled through a pile of loose papers on the table in front of her. "Well, we know it's big, and it's probably territorial. Strong bite force, looking at the wounds. Mouth shape suggests something reptilian, but none of the caimans or monitors we know of get anywhere near this big. It's completely believable that a large semi-aquatic animal we've never seen before could lurk in the muddy, confusing waters out there. Reptiles have a tendency to blend into their environments incredibly well. Beamaka, do the locals have any stories of giant monsters in the swamp?" "What's giant, and what's a monster? Every isolated group has tales of monsters in the wilderness which surrounds them. Tall tales in Vilsavian, the word's right there. However, I can ask the elders about a man-eating lizard in the waters out there. Plots 11 and 12, was it?" Garrett, a mousy Villasavian man who'd been furiously taking the minutes, took the moment for a deep breath and to adjust his glasses before nodding. That's not a good sentence. That needs help. Garrett, a mousy Villasavian man who'd been furiously taking the minutes, took a moment for a deep breath and to adjust his glasses before nodding. 11 and 12, yes. Furthest plot southwest of headquarters currently. Ibeamaka nodded deeply, his brow furrowed in thought. That'd be immediately due south of the village. Their roads through the swamp are very established and very specific, and it can be hard to tell in the gloom, but I'd say that area fits the bill from what I know. As I say, I'll ask them. Clarissa fixed Collins in her gaze. If this is a great lizard, and if we do know where it is, we are interested in how you would deal with it. Your antiseptic poultice was ingenious, and Reyes told me of your experiments percolating back at your bunk. Your use of chomba has my interests quite piqued. This caused a quiet rustling among the other two dark-complected people at the table. Clarissa still hadn't blinked. You will give me a taste, I hope, she said pleasantly. Collins was suddenly aware of the ever-present humidity. He nodded. Believe me, madam, if I'd brewed something with the chomba and was proud of the results, I'd bring it right to you. A genuine smile broke Clarissa's stern expression. I imagine you would. So, how do you deal with the problem without harming the surroundings? Scavengers will return anything you put into the creature to the water, meaning it will permeate everything else. We obviously cannot fight it. Can you mix something up? Collins nodded slowly. Yes, a large enough dose of traditional poisons will poison everything around it, too. And without knowing anything about its exact biology, we can't know what'll be most effective or work quickest, which raises the dose further. I imagine there's an alchemical answer. Some interaction between materials will surely be highly toxic in small doses. How quickly do I have to work? Charles sat forward in his chair, nodding and stroking his white goatee. That is the question, isn't it? Pools 11 and 12 could run self-sustaining for roughly a month, provided no predators get in. 3 weeks round trip to Villasov. Resources? Our people are our most important resource. This takes top priority. Within reason, you have our full backing. Can you solve this problem, Collins? Charles stood and extended his hand toward Collins. Collins stood and shook Charles' hand. I'll certainly do my best. Everyone else stood as well, so Collins thanked the room and made to leave. Before he reached the door, though, Clarissa caught his sleeve. I thought I would invite myself along to your workspace, and then perhaps show you my own. Her eyes glinted as she said it. Collins' own eyes lit up at the prospect. You... Of course! I thought so, she said, as they made their way outside. I think we will say... Oh, wow, that's...